So we've got a lot to unpack with this election. You've given us a ton of source material, and it's amazing how these different forces are playing out. Like, one thing that really jumped out at me was how the Republicans are approaching the economy. I mean, you pointed out a few articles where they seem to be almost rooting for a downturn.
Yeah, it's a fascinating strategy. It's inherently risky, but the potential payoff is huge. Historically, voters tend to hold the incumbent party responsible when the economy takes a nosedive.
Right. It's like they want to make this election a referendum on Biden's economic record.
Exactly. And there's a certain logic to it. I mean, if you look back at past elections, like 1980, for example.
With Reagan and Carter.
Right. The Iranian hostage crisis, sky-high inflation, it created this perfect storm that swept Reagan into office. And the Republicans seem to be hoping for a repeat performance this time around.
Yeah. One of the articles you sent over had this quote from a Republican strategist. Let me see if I can find it. Here it is. He said, "Voters vote their wallets, and right now their wallets are hurting."
And that message resonates especially strongly with working-class voters. A lot of folks are struggling to keep up with the rising cost of living, and they might be receptive to the argument that Biden's policies are making things worse.
Especially with inflation and everything.
Exactly. And it's not just about pointing fingers. The Republicans are trying to paint this picture of a failing economy that only they can fix. It's a bold gamble, for sure.
It is. So how do the Democrats counter that? What's their strategy going into this election?
Well, they're walking a tightrope. I mean, they have to try to stabilize the economy while also convincing voters that things are actually moving in the right direction.
Which is a tough sell when people are feeling the pinch in their everyday lives.
Absolutely. They'll likely point to things like job creation and the infrastructure investments that are starting to happen.
Yeah.
Trying to sell a vision of a more secure future, even if the present feels a bit shaky.
Yeah. It's a tough sell, especially when you've got all these global events adding fuel to the fire.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot to untangle.
And speaking of adding fuel to the fire, we also talked about wanting to dig into how other countries view this election.
Right.
And you found some pretty interesting stuff on that. It seems like there are some pretty powerful people around the world who are watching this election very, very closely.
Oh, absolutely. The U.S. elections are always a global event. But this one in particular, well, I think a lot of foreign leaders are looking at it as a sort of referendum on the direction of U.S. foreign policy.
Right, because it was such a drastic shift between Trump and Biden.
Exactly, like night and day in some respects. So yeah, a lot of world leaders are definitely feeling a sense of whiplash. Let's start with Russia, for instance. One of the articles you sent me had this really interesting analysis of how Putin views the election.
Yeah, I think I remember that one. It was saying that he sees a clear advantage if the Republicans win.
Right. And it's not hard to see why. You have to remember Trump's stance on NATO, for example.
Yeah, he wasn't exactly a fan of NATO, was he?
Not really. He questioned its relevance constantly, even hinted that the U.S. might pull out altogether.
Which must have been terrifying for some of our allies.
To say the least. But for Putin, it was like music to his ears. A weakened NATO, a less engaged U.S. on the world stage, that's exactly what he wants.
And what about Ukraine? How does that factor into Putin's calculations?
Well, that's another area where Trump's approach was, let's just say, more to Putin's liking. Under Trump, there was less direct military support for Ukraine, and certainly less pressure on Russia to de-escalate the situation.
So basically, a second Trump term would be a green light for Putin to do whatever he wants in Ukraine.
Pretty much. And contrast that with Biden's approach. Strengthening alliances, rallying support for Ukraine, taking a hard line against Russian aggression. It's a complete 180 from the Trump era.
And you have to wonder how someone like Putin interprets that. I mean, Biden keeps talking about these red lines, but does Putin see them as a deterrent or more like a challenge?
Yeah, it's a dangerous game of chicken for sure. But, it's not just Russia that's watching this election with bated breath. What about North Korea, for instance?
Oh, yeah. I'd almost forgotten about them. But they're definitely a wild card in all of this. I mean, you had that article about the whole Trump-Kim summit back in 2018.
Right, the Singapore summit.
Talk about a surreal moment in history. The first time a sitting U.S. president had actually met with a North Korean leader. The optics of that were just wild.
It was truly unprecedented. And look, it didn't result in any concrete agreements on denuclearization or anything, but it did mark a pretty significant thaw in relations between the two countries. For a while, there was this sense that maybe, just maybe, dialogue and diplomacy could actually replace the whole sanctions and threats routine.
Right. And now with Biden, it seems like we're right back to square one. Sanctions, military exercises, tensions are high again.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And you can't really blame Kim Jong-un for feeling a little nostalgic for the days of summit photo ops and personalized letters from Trump.
Right. Like maybe he's got those pictures framed on his desk or something. It really is a completely different approach now.
It is. I mean, under Biden, we've seen a return to what you might call a more traditional policy of pressure and isolation with North Korea. Whether that'll be any more effective than it has been in the past, well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Huh.
But speaking of countries with a lot at stake in this election, there's another one we should talk about. And it's a country whose perspective is arguably even more crucial given its historically close ties to the U.S.
You're talking about Israel.
Exactly. I mean, the U.S.-Israel relationship has always been complicated. But with everything going on right now, well, let's just say the stakes are incredibly high for both countries.
You're right. It's not even just about who they see as a better ally. Some of the articles you sent me from Israeli newspapers suggested that this election could actually determine the future of the entire U.S.-Israel relationship.
Exactly. And to really grasp the complexities there, it helps to rewind the clock a bit and look back at the Trump administration and, his relationship with Netanyahu.
Oh, yeah, because those two, they were practically joined at the hip for a while there.
Right. Like
Yeah.
two peas in a pod. Always on the phone with each other, always backing each other up on the world stage. It was remarkable.
Yeah, one of the articles even quoted a former Trump advisor describing their relationship as a bromance.
Yeah. I mean, look at the U.S. Embassy move to Jerusalem. That was huge.
Yeah, that was huge. I mean, Trump basically threw out decades of U.S. foreign policy with that one move.
He did. Recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, moving the U.S. Embassy there from Tel Aviv. It was a bold move. And it really pleased Netanyahu's base.
To say the least. But it also created a lot of tension internationally, right?
It did. I mean, a lot of people saw it as the U.S. taking sides in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It made it much harder to even think about restarting peace talks.
And then there was the whole Golan Heights thing, too.
Right. Trump recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which Israel captured from Syria back in 1967. Another controversial move that really delighted Netanyahu, but rubbed a lot of other countries the wrong way.
So you've got these two leaders, Trump and Netanyahu, who seem to be totally in sync on all these major issues. But how did that impact the broader situation in the Middle East? I mean, did it actually make things better or worse?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? On the one hand, you could argue that it brought a certain stability to the region. Like you had these two strongmen who were basically on the same page. But on the other hand, it also really inflamed tensions with Iran. And it made the Palestinians feel like they'd been completely sidelined.
And that brings us to today and the whole situation with Hamas.
Right, because this isn't just another flare-up in the region. This is happening right in the middle of a U.S. election where the U.S.-Israel relationship is a major issue. And the way Netanyahu's handling it, well, it's causing quite a stir.
Because it feels like he's playing a very delicate game here, right? On the one hand, he wants to appear strong and decisive to his own base. But on the other hand, he doesn't want to alienate the U.S. or jeopardize that relationship.
You got it. It's a really tough balancing act. And some of the articles you flagged suggested that he might even be trying to use this situation to his advantage in the election.
Yeah, one article I remember reading said that Netanyahu seemed to be deliberately ignoring Biden's calls for a ceasefire. Like he was trying to make Biden look weak on the world stage.
It's a risky strategy, to say the least, but it could definitely play well with certain segments of the U.S. electorate, especially those who prioritize a strong U.S.-Israel relationship above all else.
And let's be honest, that's a lot of voters.
It is. And it all ties back to this larger theme that we've been talking about, this idea of strength and leadership. Whether it's the economy or foreign policy, it seems like that's what this election really boils down to.
Who do you trust to keep the country safe and secure? Who do you trust to make the right decisions in a crisis?
Exactly. And I think for a lot of voters, the way this conflict plays out could really tip the scales one way or the other.
It's a lot for voters to weigh as they're making their decisions. We've covered so much ground today, from the economy to foreign policy to this ongoing conflict in the Middle East. It's clear this election isn't just about choosing a president. It's about the future direction of the country and its place in the world.
I couldn't agree more. And you know what the most important thing is for people to remember in all of this is that they have a voice. Every vote matters.
Well said. Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. Thanks for joining us today and for sharing your insights with us. I think I speak for all our listeners when I say that this has given us a lot to think about.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Deep Dive. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a topic shaping our world. Until then, stay curious.